The gleaming fuselage of Flight 1382 from Atlanta to San Francisco reflected the morning sun as passengers filed into the cabin. Sarah Miller smoothed her navy blue uniform and plastered on her practiced smile. After 5 years as a flight attendant for Liberty Airlines, she could do this routine in her sleep. "Good morning. Welcome aboard," Sarah chirped, her blonde ponytail bobbing as she greeted each passenger. The first-class cabin filled quickly with the usual mix of business travelers and those wealthy enough to afford the extra legroom. Sarah's practiced eye assessed each one, anticipating their needs and potential demands. Mr. 2A would definitely want an extra pillow. Ms. 4C would probably ask for a mimosa before takeoff. As the last of the first-class passengers settled in, Sarah's attention turned to the economy cabin. A tall, well-built man in his early 30s made his way down the aisle, a worn duffel bag slung over his shoulder. His dark skin glistened with a thin sheen of sweat, and his t-shirt clung to his muscular frame. Sarah's smile faltered for a moment. She'd seen his type before, probably an athlete or wannabe rapper who thought he was God's gift to the world. Her jaw tightened imperceptibly as he approached. "Excuse me," the man said, his deep voice tinged with a hint of southern drawl. "I think I'm in 14B. Sarah glanced at his boarding pass, then at the seat number. "That's correct," she replied, her tone noticeably cooler than it had been moments before. "You'll need to store that bag in the overhead compartment." The man nodded, reaching up to open the bin. Sarah watched, irritation growing as he struggled to fit the duffel bag into the crowded space. "Sir," she said, impatience evident in her voice, "you'll need to check that bag if it doesn't fit. We can't delay takeoff for this." The man turned to her, surprise evident in his warm brown eyes. "I'm sorry, I just need a second to rearrange things. It'll fit, I promise." Sarah crossed her arms, her foot tapping an impatient rhythm on the carpeted floor. "We don't have time for this. Either get it in there now or I'll have to call the gate agent to check it." A murmur of discontent rippled through the nearby passengers. The man's cheeks darkened with embarrassment as he made one last attempt to shove the bag into place. "Ma'am," a voice called from a few rows back, "I can make some room in my bin if that would help." Sarah turned, ready to shut down the offer, but froze when she saw who had spoken. An elderly white woman with silver hair and kind eyes was already standing, reaching for her own bag. "That's very kind of you, but it's not necessary," Sarah said, forcing a smile. "Sir, please step aside. I'll take care of this." With efficiency born of years of practice, Sarah quickly rearranged the contents of the bin, creating just enough space for the man's duffel bag. She grabbed it from him without a word and shoved it into place, slamming the compartment shut with perhaps more force than necessary. "There," she said, turning back to the man. "Please take your seat. We'll be taking off shortly." The man nodded, a mix of gratitude and confusion on his face. "Thank you. I appreciate your help." As he settled into his seat, Sarah felt a twinge of guilt. Had she been too harsh? She pushed the thought aside, focusing on the tasks at hand. There were drinks to prepare, safety demonstrations to perform, and 100 other little details to manage before takeoff. But as the plane taxied down the runway, Sarah couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in the pit of her stomach. She'd dealt with difficult passengers before, but something about this interaction felt different. The man hadn't actually been difficult at all, had he? He'd been polite, even apologetic. Sarah shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts. It didn't matter now. In a few hours, they'd land in San Francisco, and she'd never see him again. Little did she know, fate had other plans. Plans that would force her to confront her own biases and change the course of her life forever. As the plane lifted off the ground, leaving the Atlanta skyline behind, Sarah had no idea that this flight would be unlike any other in her career. The real turbulence, she would soon discover, had nothing to do with the weather. As Flight 1382 reached cruising altitude, Sarah began the drink service, pushing her cart down the narrow aisle. She moved with practiced efficiency, her smile firmly in place as she served each passenger. However, her mind kept drifting back to the man in 14B. She approached his row, steeling herself for the interaction. "What would you like to drink, sir?" she asked, her tone professional but cool. The man looked up from his book, a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. His eyes met hers, and Sarah was struck by the warmth in them, despite her earlier brusqueness. "Just water, please," he said with a small smile. "And maybe a packet of peanuts if you have any?" Sarah nodded, pouring the water and handing it to him along with the peanuts. As she did, she noticed a small, framed photograph peeking out of his open bag beneath the seat. It showed a smiling older woman with kind eyes, her arm around a younger version of the man before her. Something about the woman in the photo tugged at Sarah's memory, but she couldn't quite place it. She shook off the feeling and continued down the aisle, finishing the drink service without incident. An hour into the flight, turbulence hit. The seatbelt sign dinged on, and Sarah made her way through the cabin, ensuring everyone was secure. As she passed row 14, she noticed the man struggling with his tray table, which had come loose during the shaking. Despite her earlier reservations, Sarah found herself stopping to help. Here, let me, she said, reaching over to adjust the latch. Her arm brushed against his as she worked, and she was surprised by the jolt of electricity that ran through her at the contact. You. Thank you, the man said, his voice sincere. I'm Marcus, by the way, Marcus Johnson. Sarah hesitated for a moment before responding. Sarah Miller, and you're welcome. It's my job. Marcus nodded, then glanced at the empty seat beside him. Would you like to sit for a moment? The turbulence seems to be calming down. Sarah was about to refuse when another bout of shaking nearly knocked her off her feet. Making a split-second decision, she slid into the seat, gripping the armrests. So, Marcus, she said, trying to distract herself from the turbulence, what brings you to San Francisco? Marcus's expression softened, a mix of excitement and nervousness crossing his face. I'm actually on my way to meet my birth mother for the first time. Sarah's eyes widened in surprise. Wow, that's big. How are you feeling about it? Nervous, excited, terrified? Marcus chuckled. I was adopted as a baby, raised by the most wonderful parents in Georgia. But I've always wondered about my birth mother. When I finally worked up the courage to search for her, I discovered she lives in San Francisco. As Marcus spoke, Sarah found herself drawn in by his story. The warmth in his voice when he talked about his adoptive parents, the vulnerability in his eyes when he mentioned his birth mother, it all painted a picture very different from her initial assumptions about him. That must be overwhelming, Sarah said, her tone softening. Do you know much about her? Marcus shook his head. Not really, just her name and that she works for a nonprofit organization. Oh, and I have this photo. He reached down and pulled out the framed picture Sarah had noticed earlier. As he handed it to her, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The woman in the photo, smiling alongside a teenage Marcus, was unmistakable. It was her aunt, Patricia Miller. Sarah's mind reeled. How is this possible? Aunt Patty had never mentioned having a child, let alone giving one up for adoption. And if this was true, that would mean Marcus was her. Is everything okay? Marcus asked, noticing Sarah's sudden pallor. Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. How could she tell this man, this stranger she had treated so poorly, that she might be his cousin? That the woman he was flying across the country to meet was her beloved Aunt Patty? Before she could formulate a response, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their descent into San Francisco. Sarah handed the photo back to Marcus with shaking hands. I I have to go prepare for landing, she mumbled, practically leaping out of the seat. As she moved quickly down the aisle, her mind was in chaos. The realization of her possible connection to Marcus, combined with the shame of her earlier behavior, made her feel dizzy. Sarah reached the galley and gripped the counter, taking deep breaths. She had a decision to make. Should she tell Marcus the truth about their potential relationship? Or should she let him discover it on his own when he met Aunt Patty? As the plane began its descent into San Francisco, Sarah knew one thing for certain. This flight was far from over, and the real journey was just beginning. As the plane made its final approach to San Francisco International Airport, Sarah's mind raced. The revelation about Marcus's connection to her family had thrown her into a tailspin of emotions: shock, confusion, and an overwhelming sense of guilt for her earlier behavior. She mechanically went through the landing procedures, her body on autopilot, while her thoughts whirled. Should she tell Marcus? How would he react? What would Aunt Patty say? The wheels touched down with a jolt, snapping Sarah back to reality. As passengers began to gather their belongings, she knew she had to make a decision quickly. Taking a deep breath, Sarah made her way down the aisle to row 14. Marcus was standing, pulling his duffel bag from the overhead compartment. He turned as she approached, a questioning look in his eyes. Marcus, Sarah began, her voice barely above a whisper, I need to talk to you. It's important. He nodded, confusion evident on his face. Okay, sure. What's up? Sarah glanced around at the bustling passengers. Not here. Can you wait until everyone else has disembarked? Marcus hesitated for a moment, then agreed. All right, but I don't want to miss my connecting flight. It won't take long, I promise, Sarah assured him. As the last passenger filed out, Sarah led Marcus to the now empty first-class cabin. They sat across from each other, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Marcus, I owe you an apology, Sarah began, her voice trembling slightly. My behavior earlier was inexcusable. I made assumptions about you based on nothing but my own prejudices. I'm truly sorry. Marcus's expression softened. I appreciate that, Sarah. Thank you. Sarah took another deep breath, steeling herself for what came next. But that's not why I asked you to stay. There's something else you need to know. She paused, searching for the right words. The woman in your photo, your birth mother, I know her. Marcus's eyes widened. You know her? How? She's my aunt, Patricia Miller. We call her Aunt Patty. The color drained from Marcus's face as the implications of Sarah's words sank in. Your aunt? But that would mean we're cousins, Sarah finished for him. Or at least it seems that way. Marcus leaned back in his seat, his mind visibly reeling from the information. I can't believe this. All these years of wondering, and now, how did you not know about me? Sarah shook her head. I had no idea. Aunt Patty never mentioned having a child or giving one up for adoption. It was as much a shock to me as it is to you. A moment of silence passed between them, both lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Marcus spoke. So, what happens now? Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. I think we should call Aunt Patty. She's expecting you, right? Marcus nodded. She's supposed to pick me up at the airport. With shaking hands, Sarah dialed the familiar number. It rang twice before a warm, familiar voice answered. Sarah, honey, is everything okay? Hi, Aunt Patty, Sarah said, her voice quavering. I'm fine, but there's someone here you need to talk to. She handed the phone to Marcus. Marcus took it, his own hand trembling. Hello, he said, his deep voice cracking slightly. There was a pause on the other end of the line, then a sharp intake of breath. Marcus, is that you? As Marcus began to speak with the mother he'd never known, Sarah watched the play of emotions across his face. Joy, nervousness, a hint of anger, and finally, a cautious hope. The conversation was brief, filled with tears, and promises to talk more in person. When it ended, Marcus handed the phone back to Sarah, his eyes glistening. She's on her way, he said softly. She wants to meet us both at the arrivals area. Sarah nodded, a lump forming in her throat. Marcus, I don't know what to say. This is all so overwhelming. Marcus reached out and took her hand, surprising them both. I know, but maybe this is a chance for both of us. A chance to learn, to grow, to become better people. Sarah squeezed his hand, feeling a connection she never expected. I'd like that, she said, and I promise I'll do better, be better. As they made their way off the plane and towards the arrivals area, Sarah felt a mix of anxiety and anticipation. She knew that the conversation ahead would be difficult, filled with explanations, and probably more than a few tears. But she also felt a glimmer of hope. This unexpected connection with Marcus had already begun to change her, forcing her to confront her own biases and assumptions. As they walked side by side, no longer strangers but family, Sarah realized that sometimes the most turbulent flights could lead to the smoothest landings. The arrivals area loomed ahead, and with it, the promise of a new chapter in all their lives. Sarah took a deep breath, ready to face whatever came next. Together. The bustling arrivals area of San Francisco International Airport was a sea of emotional reunions, tearful goodbyes, and anticipatory embraces. Amidst this chaos, Sarah and Marcus stood side by side, an unlikely pair connected by an unexpected twist of fate. Sarah scanned the crowd, her heart racing. She had seen Aunt Patty just a few months ago at a family gathering, but this time felt different. The weight of the secrets about to be revealed pressed heavily on her shoulders. There, Marcus said softly, pointing to a figure making her way through the crowd. Sarah followed his gaze and saw her aunt. Patricia Miller looked just as she always had, her silver hair neatly coiffed, her clothes impeccable, and her face etched with a mixture of anxiety and hope. As she approached, her eyes darted between Sarah and Marcus, widening with recognition. Marcus? Aunt Patty breathed, coming to a stop in front of them. Her hand reached out, trembling slightly, as if she wanted to touch him, but was afraid he might disappear. Marcus stood frozen for a moment, taking in the woman he'd wondered about for so long. Then, in two quick strides, he closed the distance between them and enveloped her in a tight hug. Sarah watched, tears welling in her eyes as her aunt and newfound cousin embraced. The raw emotion of the moment was palpable, years of longing and questions crystallizing into this single point in time. After what seemed like an eternity, they separated. Aunt Patty wiped her eyes and turned to Sarah. "And you, my dear," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "How on earth did you end up here?" Sarah swallowed hard. "It's a long story, Aunt Patty. Maybe we should go somewhere more private to talk." Aunt Patty nodded, composing herself. "Of course. You're right. I have a car waiting. We can go to my house." The ride to Aunt Patty's home in the quiet suburb of Palo Alto was filled with an awkward silence, punctuated only by the soft classical music playing on the radio. Sarah sat in the back, watching as Marcus and Aunt Patty stole glances at each other from the front seats, both seemingly unsure of how to begin. As they pulled into the driveway of a modest but well-kept craftsman-style house, Sarah felt a sense of déjà vu. She had visited this house many times over the years, but never with the knowledge she now possessed. Once inside, they gathered in the living room. Family photos adorned the walls, and Sarah noticed Marcus studying them intently, perhaps searching for traces of himself in the faces of relatives he'd never known. "I suppose I owe you both an explanation," Aunt Patty began, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Marcus, I want you to know that giving you up was the hardest decision I've ever made." As Aunt Patty recounted the story of Marcus's birth and adoption, Sarah listened in stunned silence. She learned of her aunt's young love affair, the unexpected pregnancy, and the heart-wrenching choice to give her baby a chance at a better life than she could provide at the time. "But why keep it a secret from the family?" Sarah asked when Aunt Patty finished. "Why didn't you tell us?" Aunt Patty sighed heavily. "Shame, I suppose. Fear of judgment. And as the years went by, it became harder and harder to bring up. I told myself that Marcus was better off not knowing, that I was protecting him, but I was really just protecting myself." Marcus, who had been quiet throughout the explanation, finally spoke. "I understand why you did what you did," he said slowly. "I had a good life, loving parents, but I always felt like a part of me was missing. I needed to know where I came from." Aunt Patty reached out and took his hand. "I'm so sorry, Marcus. I hope you can forgive me." Marcus squeezed her hand. "I think I can. It might take some time, but I want to try." Sarah watched this exchange, feeling like an intruder on a deeply personal moment. But then Marcus turned to her. "And Sarah, I owe you thanks. If you hadn't recognized Aunt Patty in that photo, who knows how this meeting would have gone?" Sarah felt a flush of shame creep up her neck. "Marcus, I need to confess something. When you first boarded the plane, I treated you poorly. I made assumptions about you based solely on your appearance. I'm deeply ashamed of my behavior, and I'm sorry." To Sarah's surprise, Marcus smiled. "I know," he said gently. "I could tell something was off, but the fact that you recognized your mistake, apologized, and then went out of your way to make this connection happen, that says a lot about your character, Sarah." Aunt Patty looked between them, confusion evident on her face. What exactly happened on that plane? As Sarah recounted the events of the flight, her voice shaking with emotion, she saw the disappointment in her aunt's eyes. But there was something else there, too. Understanding, and perhaps a glimmer of pride at Sarah's eventual actions. "Oh, Sarah," Aunt Patty said when she finished, "we all make mistakes. The important thing is that we learn from them and do better." Marcus nodded in agreement. "Exactly. And I think this whole experience has taught us all something about assumptions, forgiveness, and the importance of family, both the ones we're born into and the ones we choose." As the afternoon wore on, the initial awkwardness began to dissipate. They shared stories, looked through old photo albums, and began the process of getting to know each other as family. Sarah watched as Aunt Patty and Marcus gradually relaxed, their similarities becoming more apparent with each passing hour. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow through the windows, Sarah excused herself to make a phone call. She stepped out onto the back porch, dialing a familiar number. "Hey, Mom," she said when her mother answered. "You're not going to believe what happened today." As Sarah began to recount the day's events to her mother, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. This day had been a whirlwind of emotions and revelations, but it had also been a powerful lesson in empathy, forgiveness, and the unexpected ways that life can bring people together. From inside, she could hear the muffled sounds of Marcus and Aunt Patty laughing over some shared joke. Sarah smiled to herself. Their journey was just beginning, but already she could see the bonds of family forming, stronger than any prejudice or misunderstanding. As she turned to rejoin them, Sarah made a silent promise to herself. She would carry this lesson with her always, striving to see beyond surface appearances and to treat every person she encountered with the respect and kindness they deserved. After all, you never know when a stranger might turn out to be family. The next morning, Sarah woke up on Aunt Patty's couch, momentarily disoriented. As the events of the previous day came flooding back, she sat up, rubbing her eyes. The house was quiet, but the aroma of fresh coffee wafted from the kitchen. She found Marcus and Aunt Patty sitting at the kitchen table, both cradling mugs of coffee and engaged in quiet conversation. They looked up as she entered, and Sarah was struck by how natural they seemed together, as if they'd known each other for years instead of hours. "Good morning," Aunt Patty said warmly. "There's coffee in the pot if you'd like some." Sarah nodded gratefully, pouring herself a cup before joining them at the table. "So, what's the plan for today?" she asked, curious about how this newfound family dynamic would unfold. Marcus smiled. "Aunt Patty's offered to show me around the city. We thought we'd start with the Golden Gate Bridge, then maybe explore Fisherman's Wharf." "That sounds wonderful," Sarah said, a twinge of sadness in her voice. "I wish I could join you, but I have a return flight to Atlanta this afternoon." Aunt Patty reached out and squeezed her hand. "We understand, dear. Your job comes first, but promise you'll come visit again soon? I think we have a lot of catching up to do as a family." Sarah nodded, feeling a lump form in her throat. "Amos, I'd like that very much." As they finished breakfast, Sarah couldn't help but marvel at how much had changed in just 24 hours. She had boarded that flight to San Francisco as one person and was leaving as someone entirely different. Before she left for the airport, Sarah pulled Marcus aside. "I just wanted to say again how sorry I am for my behavior when we first met, and to thank you for your forgiveness. It means more than you know." Marcus smiled, his warm brown eyes crinkling at the corners. "Sarah, we all make mistakes. What matters is how we learn and grow from them. I think this experience has changed both of us for the better." Sarah nodded, blinking back tears. "It certainly has. I promise I'll do better, be better, not just with you, but with everyone I meet." "That's all anyone can ask," Marcus said, pulling her into a hug. "Take care, cousin. I'll see you soon." As Sarah said her goodbyes and headed to the airport, she felt a mix of emotions: sadness at leaving her newfound family, excitement for what the future might hold, and a deep sense of gratitude for the lessons she'd learned. On the flight back to Atlanta, Sarah found herself reflecting on the events of the past day. She thought about how easily she had judged Marcus based on nothing but his appearance, and how wrong she had been. She thought about Aunt Patty carrying a secret for so many years out of fear and shame. And she thought about the incredible capacity for forgiveness and love that both of them had shown. As the plane touched down in Atlanta, Sarah made a decision. She pulled out her phone and composed an email to her supervisor at the airline. "Dear Mr. Johnson, I am writing to request the opportunity to lead a diversity and inclusion training program for our flight staff. Recent events have made me acutely aware of the unconscious biases we may carry and how they can affect our interactions with passengers. I believe that by addressing these issues head on, we can provide better service and create a more welcoming environment for all our customers. I would be happy to discuss this further at your convenience. Best regards, Sarah Miller." Hitting send, Sarah felt a sense of purpose wash over her. She couldn't change what had happened, but she could use her experience to help others avoid making the same mistakes. Over the next few months, Sarah threw herself into developing the training program. She stayed in close contact with Marcus and Aunt Patty, often calling them for advice or just to chat. She watched with joy as their relationship blossomed and felt her own bond with them grow stronger with each passing day. 6 months after that fateful flight, Sarah stood in front of a room full of her fellow flight attendants, ready to lead her first diversity training session. As she looked out at the sea of faces, she took a deep breath and began, "Thank you all for being here today. I'd like to start by sharing a personal story. It begins with a flight to San Francisco, a rude flight attendant, and a passenger who turned out to be much more than he seemed. As Sarah recounted her story, she saw understanding dawn on the faces of her colleagues. She saw nods of recognition, looks of shame, and expressions of determination to do better. And as she spoke, Sarah felt a profound sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the unexpected journey that had brought her to this moment. Gratitude for the family she had found. And gratitude for the opportunity to turn a moment of prejudice into a lifetime of understanding. The lesson she had learned at 30,000 feet would now ripple out, touching the lives of countless others. And in that moment, Sarah knew that sometimes the most important journeys we take aren't measured in miles, but in the distance we travel within ourselves. 1 year had passed since that life-changing flight to San Francisco. Sarah stood at the gate in Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, watching passengers board the plane she would be serving on today. But this wasn't just any flight, it was a special one. Sarah smiled as she spotted two familiar faces in the crowd. Marcus, looking sharp in a tailored suit, was escorting Aunt Patty, who beamed with pride as they approached the gate. "Welcome aboard," Sarah said, her voice filled with warmth. "It's so good to see you both." Aunt Patty pulled Sarah into a tight hug. "We wouldn't miss this for the world, dear." Marcus grinned, giving Sarah a quick embrace. "Yeah, how often do you get to see your cousin receive an award at 30,000 feet?" Sarah felt a blush creep up her cheeks. Today she was being honored by the airline for her work in implementing the diversity and inclusion training program. The CEO himself was on board to present the award mid-flight. As Sarah helped them to their first-class seats, a surprise upgrade she had arranged, she couldn't help but marvel at how far they'd all come. Over the past year, she had visited San Francisco several times, watching as Marcus and Aunt Patty's relationship deepened. They had worked through their initial awkwardness, dealt with years of unspoken feelings, and emerged as a strong family unit. For her part, Sarah had thrown herself into her work with renewed passion. The diversity training program she had developed had been so successful that it was now being implemented across all of the airline's routes. She had spoken at conferences, mentored new flight attendants, and never missed an opportunity to share her story as a cautionary tale and a beacon of hope. As the plane took off, Sarah went about her duties, her interactions with passengers now infused with a genuine warmth and openness that had been missing before. She made a point of connecting with everyone, from the nervous first-time flyer to the grumpy business traveler. Midway through the flight, the captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing a special presentation. Sarah made her way to the front of the plane, her heart pounding as the CEO stood up to address the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "today we have the privilege of honoring one of our own. Flight attendant Sarah Miller has shown exceptional leadership in promoting diversity, inclusion, and understanding among our staff and passengers. The Danes Tuori Diat Siko wish for a Dinut." As the CEO spoke about her achievements, Sarah's mind wandered back to that first flight with Marcus. How different things could have been if she hadn't recognized her mistake, if she hadn't taken that crucial step to make things right. After receiving her award to a round of applause from the passengers, Sarah made her way back to where Marcus and Aunt Patty were seated. "We are so proud of you, Sarah," Aunt Patty said, her eyes glistening with tears. Marcus nodded in agreement. "You've taken something negative and turned it into a force for good. That's really amazing." Sarah felt overwhelmed with emotion. "I couldn't have done it without you both," she said softly. "You taught me the true meaning of forgiveness and family." As she returned to her duties, Sarah felt a sense of completeness. The journey that had begun a year ago on a flight much like this one had come full circle. But it wasn't really an ending. It was a new beginning. Later, as the plane began its descent into San Francisco, Sarah looked out at the golden sunset painting the sky. She thought about the countless lives that had been touched by her program, the conversations it had sparked, and the changes it had inspired. But more than that, she thought about the personal transformation she had undergone. The Sarah who had boarded that flight a year ago was a different person, closed off, judgmental, unaware of her own biases. The Sarah of today was open, empathetic, and constantly striving to understand and connect with others. As the wheels touched down on the runway, Sarah felt a sense of homecoming. Not just because San Francisco had become a second home to her over the past year, but because she had finally come home to herself, the person she was always meant to be. The plane taxied to the gate, and Sarah prepared for the final announcement. As she picked up the intercom, she paused for a moment, looking at the diverse faces of the passengers around her. Each one had a story, each one was valuable, each one deserved respect and kindness. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice clear and confident, "welcome to San Francisco. On behalf of the entire crew, I'd like to thank you for flying with us today. Remember, no matter where you've come from or where you're going, we're all on this journey together. Let's make it a good one." As the passengers began to disembark, Sarah caught Marcus's eye. He gave her a thumbs up and a wide smile. Aunt Patty, standing beside him, nodded approvingly. Sarah smiled back, feeling a deep sense of peace and purpose. The lesson she had learned at 30,000 feet had not only changed her life, but was now changing the lives of others. And as she watched the diverse stream of passengers file past her, Sarah knew that this was just the beginning of a much larger journey, one of understanding, empathy, and connection that would last a lifetime.